Richard George and me received his BA in English Studies at the University of the Basque Country, it is here, and later proceeded to enhance his knowledge in the field of the literature with an MA in Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama, University College Dublin, where his minor thesis on the relation of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and the Gothic tradition was supervised by Declan Hybert. He completed a PhD at the University of Santiago de Compostela, researching the relationship between the short story and the Irish Gothic tradition in the writings of James Clarence Mangan and Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and Bram Stoker. Neat. I guess the floor is mine. Well, the title of the conference, of course, you can see, Appropriating the Irish Faerie, Reinterpreting the Trope of the Good People in J.S. Le Fanu's The Child That Went with the Fairies, and Claire Keegan's The Night of the Quickened Trees. Despite their different temporal frames, both Keegan's The Night of the Quickened Trees and Le Fanu's The Child That Went with the Fairies share common points which seem to stem from both stories' common inception, that is, the Irish folk tale. In this sense, it is interesting to notice that both stories' structures are demarcated by the folktale in their narrative layout, which thus conditions the narrative pace, style, and language. Similarly, both stories provide a picture of religion and folkloric beliefs, portraying them on a par, as reciprocally concomitant to each other in Irish society. Given the rural origins of both writers concerned, their resorting to Irish folktales is rather unsurprising. Although born in Dublin, where he would spend most of his later life, J.S. Le Fanu was raised in rural Limerick, where he resided until the age of 20, and where he would become acquainted with the rich oral Irish folk tradition. McCormack highlights how Le Fanu, and I quote, will base some of his stories on legends picked up at Kilkee, end of quote. On the other hand, the stories in Walk the Blue Fields are all set in rural Ireland, including the last story in the collection, The Night of the Quickened Trees. These stories reflect the rural landscape Keegan was exposed to while growing up on a farm at the heart of rural Wicklow. Le Fanu's The Child That Went with the Fairies is the author's own adaptation of the widespread legend of the changelings, where fairies abduct a human child, usually replacing them with one of their own. In his version, however, there is no replacement, only abduction, the fact which McCormack has interpreted as Le Fanu's portrayal of human acceptance of death. Le Fanu's story narrates the misadventures of Moll Ryan, the disappearance of her youngest child, Liam. One day, while Moll is out working on the fields, her offspring wander away near the outline of Lisnavura, and I quote, lonely hell haunt of the good people, as the fairies are called euphemistically, end of quote. As sunset approaches, or her offspring but Liam return home, the narrative then proceeds to relate how, and I quote, a beautiful and very grand-looking lady, end of quote, connives young Liam to hop on into her carriage, subsequently disappearing amid an eddy, and I quote, driving in the center of it, end of quote, and leaving the rest of the kids to return home to their mother. The narrative closes with the subsequent visits Liam's spirit pays his family until one day Liam appears one last time and is seen no more. And I quote, so little Billy was dead to mother, brother, and sisters, but no grave received him, end of quote. Keegan's story narrates the arrival of Margaret in the hill of Donegal, County Clare, close to the cliffs of Moher on the west coast of Ireland. There she moves into the house of a recently deceased priest, her relative, and as the narrative unveils, her former lover. The Night of the Quickened Trees relates Margaret's attempts to deal with her past and adapt to her new environment and community, with a great part of the narration being a mixture of present narrative action interspersed with past recalling. As the narrative unfolds, the reader is introduced to her odd neighbour, Stack, and the gossips of the nearest town and the harshness of landscape. After a visit to a fortune teller, Margaret becomes the town's healer, which prompts a momentary acceptance of the heart of the community. However, as time passes by, Margaret's willingness to exercise her healing powers wanes. She becomes the target of the town's anger. This reaction prompts Margaret to fulfill her early promise, and I quote, she decided she would stay in that house for as long as she could without harming anybody or letting anybody harm her. If either of these things happened, she would move on, end of quote. In both cases, we can appreciate the magic references and I quote, extraordinary eruptions that recall the pre-modern rural oral folk culture, end of quote. Le Fanu's adaptation of the fairy tale framework embeds the concept of loss and acceptance in an impoverished rural setting. Similarly, Keegan could have opted for a different narrative approach to tell Margaret's story, which is, in the end, a story of failed acceptance of the heart of a community. Both writers, however, decided to adopt and adapt the narrative frame of the Irish folktale to embed their narrations. Proof of this is how both narratives are constrained by the folktale in their development. In The Child That Went with the Fairies, the narrator's voice both opens and closes the fairy tale narration. Thus, after introducing the setting, presenting the characters, and providing the main gist of the story's development, the narrator asserts, and I quote, the two children, sometimes speaking together, often interrupting one another, managed to tell this strange story, which I had better relate connectedly and in my own language, end of quote. This act of translation, by which the narrative voice transmits the kernel of a story while retaining control over it, has a potent side effect, as it distances the main narration from present time, vaguely placing it in a remote past, while paradoxically embedding it in a sense of proximity conferred by the first-hand knowledge attributed to the narrative voice. Keegan's approach is presented in opposite terms, as the narrative proper is preceded and followed by references to Irish folktales. Although these actions do not arguably belong to the narrative itself, nor is there any intention that the reader takes them to be part of it, structurally they do form part of a story, as they are located immediately after the title section. It is indeed remarkable how both stories facilitate a post-colonial interpretation through their appropriation of the fairy tale narrative. Lefano's story follows Carassi's argument that a fairy tale forms, and I quote, an ideal middle ground in which myth, legend, and history can flow together and interact, end of quote. Interestingly, in this case, Lefano's adaptation of a fairy tale evokes Ireland's history of colonial occupation by set and deployment. On contextualizing the story, the narrative voice asserts that, and I quote, eastward of the old city of Limerick, about 10 Irish miles under the range of mountains known as the VII Hills, famous as having afforded Sarsfield sheltered among their rocks and hollows when he crossed them in his gallant descent upon the cannon and ammunition of King William, on its way to the beleaguering army, there runs a very old narrow road, end of quote. There can be little doubt as to Lefano's willingness to highlight the narrative importance of a historical past, otherwise entirely disconnected with the narrative per se. The overt references to the first siege of Limerick, in which the Gaelic and Old English descendant William Sarsfield play a significant role in resisting invasion, acquires a central focus in the opening paragraph, whose main function should be to localize setting. It is otherwise difficult to justify the length and convolutedness of the onset of the story, which indeed would more succinctly read, and I quote, east of the old city of Limerick, about 10 Irish miles under the range of mountains known as the Sleevham Hills, there runs a very old narrow road, end of quote. Considering its opening paragraph, it is the opening paragraph, I sustain this description conditions the remainder of the story, creating an intrinsic link between the main setting and its colonial past, locating the narration's actions at the center of Ireland's post-colonial conundrum. As the narrative unveils, the action unfolds in a setting reminiscent of desolation and poverty. Thus, the landscape is described with such expressions as singularly lonely, solitary road, deserted country, or scanty pasturage inhabited by a few scattered sheep. But most strikingly, such descriptions evocative of desolation and poverty are always coated with references to the military, however subtle these may be. Thus, in the first paragraph, the road leading to Dublin is described as running through, and I quote, bog and pasture, hill and hollow, Strofhat village, and roofless castle, end of quote. Immediately after this, the Irish mountains surrounding the setting are described as, and I quote, broken with lines of grey rock that resemble the bold and irregular outlines of fortifications, end of quote. This analogy is further reproduced when the narrator describes the abode of the protagonist and the different religious and superstitious elements which can be found there, which brings the narrative voice to assert, and I quote, here certainly were defences and bulwarks against intrusion, end of quote. Lefano's narrative establishes a connection between the Irish past of colonial occupation and the harshness of the landscape, which connection seems to be the intrinsic cause for the widespread poverty which permeates the narration. This is indeed summarized in the opening sentence of the story's fourth paragraph, when introducing the character of Moll Ryan, and I quote, poor was this widow in the land of poverty, end of quote. In Keegan's case, the narrative proper is preceded and followed by references to Irish folktales. Although these sections are extraneous to the narrative proper, structurally they do form part of the story, as they are located immediately after the title section. Indeed, the introductory part works as a conditioning device. This section, taken, and I quote, from Feet to Water, an Irish fairy tale, end of quote, plays a twofold function. While it introduces one of our running themes in this story, that of superstition, it also conditions the reader's perception of the narrative. Thus, even before the narrative proper has started, the reader knows that, and I quote, the old people always said that a bad time might come into the house if Feet to Water was kept inside and not thrown out, end of quote. Keegan's story, therefore, begins by the appropriating part of an Irish fairy tale, a part which indeed is central to the understanding of a story. Most remarkably, however, the story emanates from this fairy tale structure she has purposefully selected as the source of the story. On the other hand, the closing section is entitled, and I quote, some notes on folklore/stories, end quote. More practical in nature, this section provides readers with more convenient information, such as the fact that, and I quote, placing the tongs across the pram is said to prevent fairies from stealing the child, end of quote, or the fact that Wicklow people, and I quote, are nicknamed goat suckers, end of quote. While information such as this is not strictly necessary to comprehend the story, does help readers gain a better understanding of the different characters' behavior. Paradoxically, being the more logical, explanatory section also highlights the folk nature of a story proper. From beginning to end, the reader is conditioned into accepting the narrative pace and structure of the Irish folktale adapted by Keegan. There are two clear markers which qualify Keegan's story as an adaptation of the Irish fairy tale: mode of narration and deployment of time and space. One of the main characters of the folk tale is that, characteristics of the folk tale is that narration, and I quote, passes gradually from personal into impersonal mode, end of quote. This means that the narration moves from a first-person anecdote to a third-person narrative onto a local legend to finally become a folk tale. In turn, this affects the figure of the narrator, which goes from subject/witness to informant/retailer onto anecdotalist to finally become a storyteller. As in Lefano's story, in The Night of the Quickened Trees, the narrative voice keeps its distance from the narration, while paradoxically retaining enough proximity to the facts narrated, which allows its voice to remain unquestioned. Indeed, this narrative ambivalence, which is maintained all throughout the narration, opens the story, and I quote, shortly after the priest died, a woman moved into his house on the hill of Dunagore, end of quote. While the beginning is certainly reminiscent of that of fairy tales, the dictic nature of expression, the priest, shouldn't pass unnoticed. This dictic usage implies that the narrator, and to some extent the reader, is or should be familiar with this figure. As it is the opening line of the story, there is no possible internal reference, which must then be placed elsewhere, outside the confines of the story proper. In fact, this figure remains elusive, being always referred to as the priest, common ground for both the protagonist, the local community, the narrator, but alien to the reader, who is left in the dark as to his real name. Keegan's narrative therefore maintains that move between the first-person anecdote and the local legend. Another common element both Lefano and Keegan's work display in their appropriation of the Irish folktale is their combined usage of folk beliefs and Christian religion. The main narrative in The Child That Went with the Fairies indeed presents these two belief systems as compatible and even complementary. Thus, as the narrative opens, the readers are illustrated as to the protective elements the widow uses to keep the evil one away, and I quote, round the cabin stood half a dozen mountain ashes. On the warm planks of the door were nailed to horseshoes, and over the lintel and spreading along the thatch grew luxuriant patches of that ancient cure for many maladies, and prophylactic against the machinations of the evil one, the house leek. Descending into the doorway in the chiaroscuro of the interior, you might discover, hanging at the head of a widow's wooden roofed bed, her beads and vial of holy water. It is noticeable that in Lefano's narrative, which progresses from outer into inner space, folk beliefs configure the first barriers against possible threats. It is only in the inner and intimate space of the bedroom that references to Christianity are to be found. This working scheme is reproduced at the end of the narrative, when Liam has already been abducted by the fairies and I quote, fairy doctors as the dealers in the preternatural who in such cases were called in, are termed, did all in them lay, but in vain. Father Tom came down and tried what holier rites could do, but equally without result, end of quote. The narrative then levels up both folk and Christian belief systems, indeed attaching greater importance to the former, which acts as the first bulwark against evil spirits. Although time constraints do not allow me to further consider this topic, it is interesting to notice that this leveling up is conducted by the peasant characters in the narrative, while the narrator, of an arguably higher social status, keeps their distance at all times. This narrative portrayal most likely stems from Lefano's seeming dislike of peasant classes, as characters embodying, and I quote, one of a ruffian mob, end of quote, and the perennial agrarian violence in Ireland, but it also opens up interesting observations on post-colonial grounds. On the other hand, The Night of the Quickened Trees fulfills Carras's requirement, as it opposes the concept of an established religion against superstition and traditional beliefs, where the former is presented as a metaphor for the univocal official Irish Republic, while the latter represents marginal Irish discourses. Keegan's narrative achievement is to present them both on a par, as a folk tale validates superstition as the legitimate and ultimately more authentic form of perceiving the world. Therefore, Keegan's narrative reclaims the legitimacy of dissentient voices, portraying them as equally acceptable as the official national discourse, since they deploy, and I quote, the idiom voice of the local language, rooted in the local environment, to summon up a world and a vision, end of quote. In the Night of the Quickened Trees, the Roman Catholic Church is established as a figure of authority at the onset of the story. The narrative voice describes the house thus, and I quote, the priest's house stood on the highest point of a hill, end of quote. Attaching to the building and its inhabitant a domineering position over the whole community. This leading preeminence in community affairs is in fact embodied in the priest, who acts as a metonymic figure for the Catholic Church and for the Irish Republic. This institutionalization is conducted via naming, or indeed not naming him, as all throughout the story he's only ever referred to as the priest. Hence his contention that, and I quote, the naming of people and places or allusions to them become an assertion and recreation of this intimate inside community, end of quote, acquires greater relevance in this narrative. While this institutional marker configures the priest as an entity within the immediate local community, it distances him both from the reader and from Margaret, despite their previous sexual attachment. Although his presence is a perennial feature in the story, the priest is ultimately perceived as an alienating figure, casting a shadow over the narration, despite not partaking in it. Thus, the figure of a priest is used to both portray the power and influence of the church over the whole community and to criticize said influence. It is Margaret's meandering inner thoughts, deftly conveyed by a present-time narrative, always undercut by past interferences, that provides readers with a glimpse of the Catholic Church as a figure of authority. Thus, Margaret recalls how the priest, and I quote, was her first cousin, and he used to come to their house every summer to make the hay, end of quote. What follows this introduction is a bucolic image of youth and love, and I quote, he would come with a fine weather and sit on top of a hayrick at her side, dig new potatoes, sharpen his appetite, pull scallions, and eat them raw, end of quote. The recurrence implied in the modality would come, followed by the ascendanton of farm-related verbs, reinforces the positive connotations of the adjective fine and new, and of the lusciousness implied in words related to physical satisfaction, appetite, and eat. This overall connotation of innocence is further strengthened by references to physical purity, like the fact that Margaret, and I quote, was it nature, end of quote, or natural purity. And I quote, skies were blue back then, end of quote. Added to this is the fact that the narration distinctly clarifies the nature of the priest and Margaret's sexual and affective relationship. And I quote, he said they would marry, that they would get the bishop's permission, rear short horns and have the children, a pigeon squatch. Margaret could see him coming in from the fields with a handful of clover, saying the meadow was without comparison, end of quote. The priest's promise implied in the modality used for prospective future actions is coupled with Margaret's vision of their potential future life together. The dysyntactic elements put together result in a reiteration of the overall bucolic connotation of her remembrance. Again, there is lusciousness in word choice, this time stemming from an overt blooming nature, rearing and having children, as well as from the pleasant, lush connotations derived from his holding a handful of clover, both in terms of sexuality and material prosperity. This bucolic image is terminated at the end of a paragraph, and I quote, and then he went off to the seminary, became a priest, became the pride of a family, who no longer called him by his name, end of quote. The abruptness of the coordinating conjunction and, in combination with two simple short sentences, helps in breaking their previous bucolic, promising cadence of the remembrance. Likewise, the emphasis on the verb become, in such a context, implies a certain disbelief of the subsequent expression, pride of a family. This is further enhanced by the fact that they stopped calling him by his name. Thus, the act of becoming a priest, the priest in Keegan's fiction, terminates the previous character, obliterating any prior instances of familial and indeed romantic and sexual intimacy. In brief, and by no means conclusive, it can be observed that both Lefanos, the child that went with the fairies, and Keegan's The Night of the Quickened Trees, deployed the features of the Irish fairy tale to conduct criticism on their contemporary Ireland and on the consequences of colonialism. Implications of these appropriations in post-colonial terms should be further considered in future research. Thank you.